I guess most people here will have met Peter before. If not, they bloody well should have. He's a regular appearer at the conventions.
Not for the last 2 years.
Yes, it's only last two.
Last 2 years I've missed.
Seriously?
Yes.
Wow.
Don't want me. They don't want me anymore.
There's no answer on the board.
I did offer them a talk on radio in modern medicine, which the IET in Gloucestershire were very keen on, but
And RSGB didn't. No answer. But Peter has a fabulous station, lots of experience, has been in IET since he was man and a boy up in Yorkshire somewhere.
not IET. Not IET.
Oh no, the other lot. Sorry.
Institution of Electrical and Electronic Engineers Incorporated.
Yeah, them.
Piscataway, New Jersey.
Yes.
But yeah, and has been representing amateurs in the UK and beyond on various bodies in ITU, etc., etc. Wealth of experience, and that's basically where he's coming from tonight. Where do our wavelengths come from? And with that, having misintroduced him several times, I let him set the record straight, and the fact if everyone's read the email that gave us a bit of a CV anyway. So, welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Of course, at RSGB, I normally have beer instead of tea. Even at W9DXCC, I had beer instead of tea.
You told me you didn't do beer talks anymore, Chadwick.
Right. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Let's look, first of all, at where radio regulation came from, because that's where we all have to start with the history of telecommunications. And in 1839, Cook and Wheatstone introduced their 5-needle electric telegraph on the Great Western Railway from Slough to Paddington, or Paddington to Slough. And the interesting point was John Towell in 1845. A bit of a dirty trick, because he laced his mistress's stout with cyanide. And caught a train to London, thinking he'd hide away in the great metropolis. But they sent a telegraph message that to look for a man in the garb of a Quaker. And Cook and Wheatstone's telegraph didn't have a Q. It couldn't send a Q, so it was KWAKER. But it worked. Probably the first case of the criminal being caught by means of telecommunications. Of course, the famous one that everybody remembers, or well, no, knows of, none of you are old enough to remember, was Crippen. And in fact, for a long time, radio installations on ships were usually referred to as Crippens. Now, in 1844, Samuel F.B. Morse, Findlay Breeze Morse, who you've heard of course, with the assistance of Dale, who actually did all the work, produced a 38-mile-long telegraph line between Baltimore and Washington. Now, he had a lot of problems, did Morse, because he had an idea about using electromagnetism, but it wasn't until he actually met Professor Henry, the Henry of Henrys of inductance, that he was told he had to use insulated wire to wind electromagnets with. And of course, while he was using bare wire, he wasn't doing very well. And so they sent the opening message, "What hath God wrought?" Now, the telegraph expanded. Every country was getting telegraphs. But it led to a problem when you wanted to send a telegram internationally. And at one stage, you wanted to send a telegram to Italy? Fine. It was sent on the UK system over to France. In France, they wrote it down. They sent it on the French system over to Switzerland. They wrote it down. They sent it on the Swiss system to Italy. And there were several bits of Italy at that time, so depending where it went, it might get written down several more times. And, of course, this led to the equivalent of the famous World War I message of "Send 3 and 4pence, we're going to a dance." So in 1865, the French government proposed the formation of an international body to standardise telegraph systems across borders. May 17, 1865, the International Telegraph Union. Now, one of the countries that didn't take part in it at that time was the United States, because they were a little busy, one way or another. Although there was a transatlantic telephone cable much earlier, laid by Sir Daniel Gooch with the Great Eastern. And because of the distributed inductance and capacity of the cable, the signalling speed was low. So they decided that if they used more volts, they get the signalling speed up. Well, what they actually did was to puncture the dielectric, so they had to lay another cable. However, in 1885, they started standardising on telephony, you know, this telephone stuff, of which the man said, oh, there'll be no demand for more than 50 telephones in London. We've got an excellent system of telegraph messenger boys. Wireless appeared in 1896, and there was a preliminary conference in 1903 which led to the first International Radio Telegraph Convention. And from that, we got the radio regulations. Now, they have the force of international law, which means that they get ignored by anybody who can't be bothered with them, especially the Americans. And they're considered to be formal treaty obligations. So, in fact, when the time comes off to sign off at the end of a conference, the Americans send over an ambassador. An ambassador isn't actually very high level, and in fact the Americans treat their civil servants so well that the ambassadors have to travel economy class. The formal treaty obligations, except where countries can derogate from them or they can just ignore them. The Americans tend to just ignore them. They set up specialised committees. CCIF for telephony, CCIT for telegraphy, CCIR for radio. In fact, the CCIF and CCIT combined in the 1930s to something called CCITT, Comité Consultatif International de Télégraphe et Téléphone, because they tended to use French a lot, although the working language of the ITU is English, except that you will hear certain of the delegates will say, because we have interpreters, I will proceed in my native language, and then keeps jumping between English and his native language. Hiram Percy Maxim was the president of the American Radio Relay League, ARRL. And he was visiting Europe. And before he left the US, the ARRL board of directors asked him to represent the league in any efforts that could be made to encourage international amateur radio relations. And as a result, they came up with a statement to promote and coordinate communication, to represent their interests at international conferences, and to encourage international fraternisation. So, in fact, the whole of IARU really started from ideas of ARRL. So, on April 14, 1925, the IARU had its first meeting in Paris. Note the countries: Argentina, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Newfoundland. Why Newfoundland? Well, you may not be aware, but Newfoundland was actually not part of Canada until 1949. And until 1949, it had the call sign series VOA to VOZ and was a separate DXCC country. Quite a number of countries. You will note that ERA was absent because they were too busy at the time with the Troubles, the internal civil war. some that you wouldn't expect, such as Siam and Russia, because of course Russia was only just getting over the Russian Revolution. Yugoslavia, which was the carve-up of part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Decided headquarters would be in West Hartford, Connecticut. Now, Hartford, Connecticut is supposedly the home of the United States insurance industry and is one of those towns or cities where it is not a good idea to go walking anywhere on your own at night. It's a dodgy place, full of criminals. ARRL is there. Or actually, they're at Newington, just outside. And H.P. Maxim, the original W1AW, was the first president. And of course, you all know W1AW is the H.P. Maxim Memorial Station at ARRL. Now, how do they finance the IARU? Well, the membership is national societies. There's 178, I think it's 178 at the moment. It goes up and down a bit. And there's a levy on each society. In Europe and Africa, Region 1, it's a levy per member. So if you're not a member of your national society, they don't pay. Other parts of the world, it's a levy on how many licensed amateurs there are. So ARRL pay on the total number of US amateurs, regardless of whether they're members or not. It's a peculiar system, but there we are. However, they set it up 1925 just in time, because in 1927 there was a conference in Washington. 350 delegates, 74 countries, and the British delegation had no consultation with RSGB, didn't want to know. And the ARRL represented British amateur radio interests. It doesn't quite work like that, but, you know, please, Mr. Chairman, we want some more wavelengths. But what they came out with was international amateur bands. Top band, rather expanded, 3.5 to 4, 7 to 7.3, 14 to 14.4, 28 to 30, 56 to 60. And all looked good. Well, they had another conference in 1932. And now RSGB were allowed to send an observer. And the amateur service was formally recognised. In ITU, there are various services. The fixed service, the broadcasting service, the maritime service, the aeronautical service, en route and off route. En route is where you're going down recognised air lanes. The satellite service. But the amateur service is a formally recognised radio service. And therefore, in the bands where the amateur service is the primary service, you're not allowed to be interfered with by anybody else. Not that anybody ever bothers about that, but the Americans, of course, being an awkward set of what's-its, to say the least, say that the amateurs cannot interfere with anybody, even if it's an interloper into a band which is primarily amateur. Now, the UK approach seems to be one of, you're the primary service, they ain't, it's tough, what's it for them? But it's the only hobby to be formally recognised in international law. By 1934, International Telegraph Union seemed a bit difficult to describe radio and telephones and things of that nature, so they changed to International Telecommunications Union. And about that time they moved. By the time of the 1938 Cairo conference, trouble European military demands lost us 3635 to 3685, so 50 kilohertz cut out of 80. Broadcasting interloped to 7.2 to 7.3, and we've never got the buggers out since. But without the IARU, it would have been greater. And the new allocations were due to come into force.
Something else happened that day.
And
About that day.
the following conference was scheduled to be held in Rome in 1942.
I don't think so.
So it didn't happen. So it became Atlantic City, New Jersey. Now the UN had turned up now, and the ITU became part of and the oldest agency of the United Nations, going back to 1865. Of course, so you've got all these newcomers, UNESCO and World Health Organization and World Meteorological Organization. You know, they're all newcomers. Now we had a whole new situation. European proposal supported by the UK Post Office. Remember, at that time, the GPO was the licensing authority. They wanted to chop 80 metres down to 100 kilohertz, 40 metres to 200. The RSGB made very strong representations to the Post Office, but the Post Office carried on in their usual civil service way. And what we came out with, we sent out 6LJ and 6CL as part of the IARU delegation. Now, defeated attempts to remove amateurs completely from top band. We had to accept the loss of 100 kilohertz in 7 megs, but we got 15 metres. And we lost the top 50 kilohertz of 20 metres. We also had the Russians allocate the top 100 kilohertz or kilocycles in those days of 20 metres to the fixed service inside the Soviet Union. The old 112 meg band was lost and gone forever, aeronautical. But we got 2 metres, worldwide amateur primary band. Not, of course, that the UK MOD ever worried about that, because they went and put various bits of military into the parts of 2 metres at one time. And every 90 kilohertz from 144 upwards, you could have the military appear and demanding to be interference-free. Like later on, we got mould in 77s. Now, the regions, like Gaul, omnia Gallia in tres partes divisa est, if you've ever read Caesar's Gallic Wars, there's 3 geographic regions. Europe and Africa, Europe goes about as far east as the Urals, the Americas for region 2, and region 3 is Asia and Australasia. And there are actually maps in the radio regs of where they distinguish the line between Asia and Australasia and the Americas, because of course there's bits of the Americas way out in region 3.
So it's the fireworks at Blunsdon, they're celebrating winning the Speedway.
Right, mark the 25th anniversary in 1950, they had a congress in Paris. And the ARRL couldn't attend because they'd scheduled a board meeting. And the European societies, deciding that HQ was a bit detached, set up the Region 1 Bureau, and ARRL got, to use the vernacular, very pissed off about it. Funnily enough, as things developed, they found that they actually needed to have a similar arrangement for Regions 2 and Region 3, which is why we have the split that we have today with the 3 regions each having their own conference every 3 years. We've just had a Region 1 conference. And we still managed to handle the local issues. And as you'll see later, the local issues actually do get quite important. Moving forward to 1959, the GPO invited RSGB to nominate a delegate, not an observer, but a member of the delegation. And that was G6NZ. And that happens now that RSGB have a member of the UK delegation. The proposals included losing top 700 kilohertz of 10 metres, although who would want it and why, I don't know. The loss of 7.2 to 7.3 and drastic cuts to 3.57 and 14, and a Swedish proposal that would have gotten rid of top band altogether. Well, IARU Region 1 were there in force, and all we lost was 7.1 to 7.15, which had been shared with broadcasting. 50 years on, we got it back. So that was a success. Yes, it's not long, really. When you consider that radio regulation's been going for 110 years. The ITU moved from Bern to Geneva in 1963. I think they're both equally expensive. But Geneva's a little bit bigger.
Bern's a bit prettier.
Well, yes. There are certain facilities in Geneva which you will hear about later that aren't so there in Bern. So the CCIR and CCITT disappeared, and we have 3 sectors. ITU-T for telephony and telegraphy, which means bits these days. ITU-R for radio, and ITU-D for telecommunication matters affecting developing countries.
Like England?
No, Africa and the Middle East. So it gives them an awfully good chance to bitch about Europeans, and Americans actually as well. Now, each country is a member of ITU, or the administration is, provided they pay their dues, which is the usual thing, of course, you've got to pay your dues. A company can be a sector member, but by heck, it's expensive. And scientific and other organisations can have observer status, and that's what IARU is. So we're officially there as an observer and can put in input papers, comment on in discussions and so on. You have the Director General is in charge, the titular head, and then you have study group ones. Study group 1, spectrum management, spectrum engineering. There isn't a study group 2. I don't know if there ever was. Study group 3 is propagation, study group 4, space services, study group 5, terrestrial, 6 is broadcast, and 7 is science services, radio astronomy. Those are the people who call themselves the real DXers. Study group 5 is where the amateur and amateur satellite services live. So there's quite a lot happens. Generally speaking, our interests lie SG5, SG1, a little bit with SG4 for the amateur satellite service, but actually that generally is dealt with in SG5. And of course SG7 only where it's a matter of coexistence. Similarly, we used to be with SG6, but with HF broadcast disappearing very rapidly, that's getting less and less important. SG5 is an interesting one because that also includes aeronautical. But aeronautical requirements for HF are decreasing. And I certainly know of one guy who isn't an amateur from the CAA who wants to release a lot of the aeronautical bands, which would be very useful if we could release more of 10 megs.
When does the maritime one come in?
Maritime comes under SG5. And of course, they're not anywhere near as important now as they were once upon a time. Because, yes, they use satellites, although there are a number of HF arrangements in the US that use HF teleprinter because they're far, far cheaper than Inmarsat. Inmarsat's expensive. Mind you, when you consider in 1927 they opened the first transatlantic HF radio link, well, LF on 70-odd kilohertz, using SSB, and they charged $76 a minute for a transatlantic telegraph call. And just think how much $76 was worth in 1927. A lot of things have got cheaper. Unfortunately, not beer. Right, so study group 5 is where IARU has an important role. A lot of that is all the BS stuff on administration. There's very little technical really happens in SG5. But we have a representative in study group 1. Used to be me. It's now Ian Greenshields, G4FSU, the RSGB HF manager. And of course its working parties. IARU also attends ITUD, the development lot. And that's normally Tim Ellum, VE6 FS, is it? G4H something or other. He's a lawyer. For some reason, a lot of the IARU bigwigs are lawyers or personnel managers, or retired lawyers and personnel managers. So if you're really brave, you stand between the president, who is a Queen's Counsel for the province of Alberta, and a solicitor qualified to address the High Court, the Supreme Court in London. And on the other side was the secretary, Rod Stafford, W6ROD, who was a senior criminal court judge for San Jose County. And you tell rude stories about lawyers. Most of them they've heard before. So then you've got ITUD development. Study group 1, spectrum management. WP1A dealt with PLT, power line telecoms. I had great fun writing the whole section of the report on that, dealing with the amateur service. We now have wireless power transmission, especially because at CEPT we're looking at requirements for charging electric vehicles and the spurious emission problems that we can see from them. Plus a few interesting ones that unless they can really control it, if you get within 2 meters of it, you're in a field which is considered dangerous by ICNIRP, the International Committee on Non-Ionising Radiation Protection. WP1B is SRD, short-range devices. WP1C monitoring. The amateur service is represented usually by the IARU delegate, Ian, and there's also an ARRL employee as part of the US delegation. Now, IARU has an administrative committee that meets basically every year at a regional conference. And there's 3 regions, so each region has a conference once a year. So in any one region, it happens every 3 years. As I say, it happened this year for Region 1. We provide representation and lobbying at WRCs, inputs to the study groups, task groups and working parties, regional telecommunication organisations, and other administrative and standards bodies. So that's an awful lot of bodies to be going to. At the time of this, we had 159 members. I didn't check what the latest situation is. And as is usual with all these sort of organisations, you've got somewhere around 15 or 20 at the most who do the work, another 50, 60 or more who bitch about it, and the rest who never do anything. Well, it's usual with a committee that 1/3 do the work, 1/3 do the talking, and 1/3 do nothing. Have you noticed that, Dem?
No, people are very hard work.
Now the WRCs every few years, 4 to 5 weeks, 2,000 delegates, a lot of argument about where and when, because you have to try and avoid certain religious festivals. The Arabs certainly don't like having it during Ramadan. So, and then of course you've got a whole load who don't want it at either the Greek Easter or the Western religion, Christianity Easter. So yes, it's difficult sometimes fitting them all in. IARU volunteers attend as observers, lobbying and briefing. There are usually many amateurs in countries' delegations, but not always. And it's not unknown for meetings to finish at 03 or 0400. And one of the difficulties that you get is that certainly from some of the African countries, they're very anti-amateur radio. It's only a rich white man's hobby. And that was said to me by an African delegate. Well, I noticed what his hobby was. As the Rue de Berne in Geneva is part of the red light area. And as you walk down to the Grand Duke to get a pint of very expensive Boddingtons, then you have to go past the red light area with all the professional ladies offering their services. And every night you could see him going off with one of the professional ladies. So we know what his hobby was.
Communicating with ladies.
I don't know how he explained it on his expenses, because everything's expensive in Geneva. Then we have RTOs, Regional Telecommunications Organisations. Countries in a common geographical area. We've got CETL for the Americans. That's an interesting one because their working language is Spanish. CEPT for Europe. Well, CEPT, the working language is English. A bit like ETSI, where the working language is English. It's said with a great deal of truth that ETSI works in English because the French wouldn't have German, the Germans wouldn't have French, and the Scandinavians would have neither. So that only left them English. So ATU for Africa, African Telecommunications Union. I must admit that my experience of the African delegations is that the technical level has been 5/8 of the square root of bugger all generally. ASMG for Arab states. They're in a state of great array because the guy who was leading it was a Syrian who was in his 80s, permanently in Geneva, and he walked out of a meeting one day and then dropped dead, and there's nobody really taken over. Iran are trying to lead it, but this Middle East is in such a state of flux that it doesn't get them very far. RCC, they are reasonably well organised, as is APT and CEPT. A RTO position can mean a lot of votes. CEPT, 48. Although generally every effort is made at a WRC to achieve consensus rather than to have a vote. By the way, CEPT, Conférence Européenne des Postes et Télécommunications. European Conference of Post and Telecommunications. You've got to get your RTOs on your side for an WRC. You need it as well between times, because local agreements led to the CEPT license reciprocity, or to the 135 kilohertz band becoming available. So you have to work quite hard on the RTO side. That's even more meetings. But at ITU, IARU is very well regarded. Not uncommon for delegates to ask for an IARU opinion. Sometimes on something non-amateur related. I got asked for an opinion in WP1B on SRDs about medical matters, medical implant telemetry. And someone said, what does he know about it? And the response from somewhere else was, he only chairs the ETSI committee on it. So RTOs are a power block. Where are we? They're a power block. What have we achieved since 79? Well, in 79, we got 10, 18 and 24. In 03, we removed the Morse requirement. We restored 7.1 to 7.2. In 07, we got 135. Walk 12, we got the 472. Walk 15, we got the 5 meg allocation. We're going in 19 for worldwide 50 to 54 megahertz. So we do fairly well. Between walks, we do belly taps. We've got the intruder watch. Monitors intrusion into bands where the amateur service is a primary user. You can, some administrations will do something about it, some won't. Ofcom are fairly good. You complain to Baldock and they will check it and put in a complaint, and occasionally they'll remove intruders. But of course, you've got something like 23 or 24 countries have got footnotes to put things into 7 megs. So you've got Kenya-Somali communications for banks. Now, I shudder to think how well it communicates on the weekend of somewhere like CQ Worldwide. But we're primary, they ain't. Tough. Hold training courses for administrations to teach them about amateur radio and the value of it. That can take some doing. What else? Technical consultancy at working parties and task groups of SG1, SG5. ARRL attend, but they have to follow the party line. So they couldn't speak out against PLT. Now, the UK delegation, he'd been instructed, by this time there was only one man going from Ofcom, and he got to cover SG1, SG3, SG5, all the lot. And he happens to be an amateur. And he'd been told that he was not to speak against PLT because the EU wanted PLT and the DTI wanted PLT. So when the UK people from the UK were bitching about PLT, he'd always got another meeting to go to, which I thought was very tactful. IARU don't have these constraints. We can say what the hell we like. We're short of technical consultants, and we're short of representation at RTOs. And even if we had the technical consultants, there's a question as to whether we could actually afford for them to go. I was very fortunate when going to study group 1 on PLT, because I was taking Ian Greenshield, so that he could get into the swing of it to eventually take over. And I could persuaded my boss that because of the effects of PLT on the implanted pacemakers communicating back to the computer, that PLT could be a problem, and therefore we needed to take note of it. And it was far cheaper for him to pay all my expenses to go to ITU as IARU, which left the money available for Ian's green shields. Sometimes you win. Then we've got Region 1 and the CEPT, European Conference of Post and Telecommunications, or actually the Electronic Communications Committee. And CEPT has 3 groups: Spectrum Engineering, SE, Frequency Management, FM, and Regulatory Affairs, RA. That's the technical one. And that's generally the one that we can't get people to go to. One stage, some years back, things were a little easier because it was, in those days, the Radio Communications Agency was provided the chairman, who just happened to be G0EZY. It means that you get, the IARU gets a favourable response from the chairman. So Region 1 has an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, with CEPT. RA and FM have permanent members, although RA doesn't meet very often. SE as needed. And then each group has a particular set of project teams. So we've got PTSE 21, spurious emissions, or strictly speaking, unwanted emissions in the spurious domain, which is the official terminology. And SE 24, short-range devices, which are much more of a problem. There's also an FM working group called Short-Range Device Maintenance Group, who deal with the regulations for SRDs. So SE24 and SRDMG normally have back-to-back meetings in the same week. I think their next meeting is in December in Dublin. And these are peripatetic meetings. Sometimes they're at the European Radio Communications Office in Copenhagen, and then in other cases, administrations invite them. We had the situation a couple of years back that the Ofcom weren't looking as if they were going to manage to spend their travel budget for the year. So they promptly organised an SE24 SRDMG meeting in London so they could host it and therefore spend their budget. It's all a big game, really. Now, we don't have the funding for volunteers to attend all possible CEPT meetings. Sometimes you've got an IARU volunteer goes to a meeting in the professional capacity, which I did. And the RSGB Spectrum Forum chairman, who works for BAE Systems, goes to SE24 on the same basis. And alert the Executive Council when matters requiring formal representation occur, which they may do next month. Then we've got the real problem area. Oh God, are they a problem? The EC are taking a growing interest in telecommunications management. Now, they know 5/8 of damn all about the subject. When I tell you that one of the decision makers is a nice enough young lad, he speaks fluent French, German and English, and he has a degree in political economy. You really couldn't expect him to know about spectrum management, can't you? So they want to do frequency management, and they want flexible bands and technology neutrality. What did we find back in the 30s? We had technology neutrality, we had flexible bands, and without band plans, it was absolute bloody chaos. Can you get it through to those dickheads in the EC? No. One example of their brilliance was when the Radio Equipment Directive was proposed. And they wanted every radio transmitter to be capable of being put into a test mode so that they could check its requirements against either the ETSI standard or the requirements of the directive. And those of us doing medical electronics objected. Because the way you put it into test mode was going to be held on a secure website available to all 28 administrations in the EU. Secure. So you get somebody you don't like, a politician that you don't like, and you can turn off their pacemaker. Well, you don't turn it off. You just put it into test mode, and the battery runs down. And could we get the idiots to see this? No. So we had to lobby the European Parliament. They threw it out. The Commission went back to the Council of Ministers to try and get the requirement put back in. For once, the Council of Ministers showed a bit of sense. But it just gives you an idea of the chaos that you can get when they get involved. They wanted to get rid of all the individual administrations and have a European FCC headquartered in Budapest. Where that fell down was when all the administration says, no way. I think they put it a bit stronger than that. And one of the problems being that instead of having 28 votes at OWRC, you'd only have one. So, yes. Then we've got Eurocom. Now, that's a loose organisation which minimises the negative effects of EU legislation. We got some successes. Exclusion of kits, homebrew, second-hand equipment from EMC Directive and the Radio Equipment Directive. And before the RED, the R&TTE, the Radio and Telecommunications Terminal Equipment Directive. There are those in the Commission who view the ITU as being irrelevant in a European context, which has dangers for us. Also has dangers for them when you bear in mind that the people who allocate the slots for geostationary satellites is the ITU. So, yes, any EU country ignoring them, wanting to put up a geostationary satellite could have a problem. But most administrations are resisting the EC attempts to take over. Then we've got ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, also known occasionally as the European Touring and Sightseeing Institute, or excessive talk, seldom's interesting. There are various rules about ETSI meetings. When you all gather together to go out for dinner, you choose a small French village, and you walk down the street looking at every restaurant and rejecting every one of them, and get back to the first one to go in to find it's just closing. ETSI produces harmonised standards for commercially available amateur radio equipment, among other ones. The committee that does that happens to be headed by a guy from ICOM, which makes life a bit easier. Deutscher Amateur Radio Club is a member. IARU Region 1 is a member. Reporting of any ETSI activity inimical takes place through volunteers, other amateurs. For instance, the committee that deals with digital mobile radio and CB happens to be chaired by G4VVZ of Bradford-on-Avon, 4-metre contester. But going to ETSI is not cheap. ETSI is in the south of France, in Sophia Antipolis, which is about 10 kilometres north of Antibes. And it's not a cheap place. They went there because the France Telecom, as it was, offered them the building cheap in the first place back in the early 1990s. And they've stayed there, and no one really wants to move from Sophia Antipolis. And you've got some nice places around like Valbonne, with a nice restaurant, Les Pierres Rouges, the Red Rocks, where you go in and Annie gives you a kiss on the cheek, and her daughter gives you a kiss on the cheek, and with 6 of us, it never works out at more than €60 a head, no matter how much we eat or drink. Then we've got CISPRA and Senelec. CISPRA, Comité International Suppression Perturbation Radioélectrique, produces EMC standards at international level. It sometimes, I think mostly, appears to be more interested in increasing allowable levels of interference rather than lowering them. My personal opinion of CISPRA is it's an organisation that is somewhere like 30 years past its sell-by date. And all it really does is provide an excuse for people to go off on nice foreign jollies.
Same with all of them, isn't it?
Well, it's worse than most. Then you've got Senelec, Comité Électronique Normes Comité Européen des Normes Électroniques et Electrical and Electronic, produces various electrical standards. Most of its time, it takes International Standards Organisation standards and changes the number to an EN, and that's it. But IARU represented at CISPRA, and then you put in inputs to the national standards organisations, in our case, BSI. And maybe it gets accepted at Senelec, and maybe it don't. I'm not very impressed with Senelec either. We actually had the situation where there was a Senelec standard for pacemakers, and they persuaded Senelec that they could apply that to the radio part of pacemakers when it was totally inapplicable. So, IARU is the defence of amateur radio. Radio spectrum is a scarce and economically valuable resource. There's many pressures from outside to use spectrum dedicated to amateur radio. The cell phone people have this brilliant idea, it seems, that any frequency between about 100 megs and 1,000 gigahertz is theirs by right, and nobody else should be allowed in. Should all be cell phones. It's led to interesting problems because the introduction of mobile telephony above 2.6 gigs has got interesting problems because a lot of the RAF air defence radars get jammed. Now, they're Plessy Watchman radars dating from the 1970s, and they were supposed to be electronic countermeasures resistant because they were frequency hopping. But it was 1970s, or is 1970s technology, and you put up a 1 watt signal on 2.61 gigs, 10 miles away, and an aircraft, and you get a line on the screen, and an aircraft flies into it and comes out as a whole lot of little M's flying away. Now, part of the reason for that is because it's a badly designed radar. You do not have a 500 megahertz wide first IF with limiting amplifiers in it and expect not to get problems with intermodulation and gang compression. So I think it was a bad design even for the 1970s. So spectrum has got to be defended at national, regional and international level, and you've got to do it in a coordinated fashion. You've got to fight legislation inimical to amateur radio. And IARU do all these for all radio amateurs worldwide. All 3 million. So when Ian or I went to study group 1, we were speaking on behalf of 3 million radio amateurs worldwide. What have we done this year? Well, I've done input to CEPT report on introduction of capsule endoscopy in 430 to 440 megs. If you know what capsule endoscopy is.
How is that related to amateur radio?
430 to 440
Oh, I
megs.
see what you mean. Yeah. I was looking at the capsule endoscopy.
No.
What are we doing now?
Well, you know what capsule endoscopy is.
Why
Yeah.
do they want to put it in that particular frequency range?
Sorry?
Why do they want to put it in 70 cents particularly?
Right. Because the current sets of capsule endoscopes, which were done by an Israeli company called Given Imaging, who are now part of Medtronic, but they did that back in 2001, which was when I was sent to California on loan to the medical group for 3 days, that turned into about 4 years before being moved over for another 7 years. They were using 433.15 because that was a dedicated ISM band. It's a short-range device band for ISM as well, and it's relatively narrow, so they could go in there. Now, you have to bear in mind that the radiated power is such that you have to, in order to receive it, you've got to be very close. Anybody not know what a capsule endoscope is? Right. Well, an endoscope is a tube that either goes down your throat or up your bum. Right? Now, the problem with the standard endoscope, it has some advantages because you can put things on it that clip off polyps in the bowel, in the lower bowel. But you can't look into the small bowel, and you can't look, it's harder to look into the esophagus. So if you have a capsule, and the capsule endoscope is about 3/8 of 9 millimetres diameter and 15 millimetres long, and it has flashing lights and a little camera, and it transmits back, at the moment, FSK at about 250 kilobits per second on 433.15. And you wear a belt which has got a receiver and a recorder and antenna on. It's a lot less painful, it's a lot less dangerous because you can't get a puncture of the bowel, which you can with a standard endoscope. And it's a lot cheaper. So, and incidentally, the capsule has built-in circuitry that you can't use it again. So that's the capsule endoscope, but they want to have higher speeds and greater resolution, and so they need two cameras. So they need much greater bandwidth. So that's why they wanted to go to 430 to 440. So I had to do the interference analysis on that.
How did those two users ever come together? The amateur service on 70 SEMS and this GSM area on 70?
Well, that's not GSM, SRD. SRD ISM. Germans, Austria and Hungarians managed to push it through.
In whose interest? Did they not realise that there were existing users on those?
Well, remember, of course, the existing users in Western Europe were people like the military, with mould.
They've got more power than we've got.
Well, there was mould, and of course there's a little place called Fylingdales. What is it? ANFSM 127. Or, no, yes, AN/FSM 127 is the Fylingdales radar with the three planar radars that can give a 360-degree coverage, 800 kilowatts per. So, yes, there was that little problem. So, whoops. One of the points that we made was that after analysis, didn't think there'd be a lot of problems with interference to the amateur service. The other way round, especially in places where you've got hospitals, which there are, with a 70 centimetre repeater. But The guy writing the report is an IV3 anyway. So we had to put an input in there. IARU cooperated with Industry Canada, that's the Canadian equivalent of Ofcom, to produce an ITU input from Canada to study group 5 in support of 50 to 54 megs. We're currently doing input to a CEPT report on wireless power transmission for electric vehicle charging, because we're worried about the unwanted emissions in the spurious domain, the harmonics.
A colleague of mine works in the EMC. He's gone when I was in Germany, he's back in the UK now. He was saying that he's open on the market for a job. He's actually possibly going up north. He's saying that there's nobody in the young age group coming into the EMC.
Well, I think part of the problem, to be honest, is that electronic engineering is a very attractive occupation for somebody of private means. Is what it boils down to. There's a lot of jobs that pay an awful lot better and that are a lot less difficult. But yes, I know a number of EMC companies that don't have very good engineering, and some of them are well, literally awful. There was one UK company who did the approval tests on some paging transmitters. And there was a problem appeared that all of a sudden paging transmitters would appear on 145.000. And they'd not done the testing properly, because you have a power fail test, and if your power fails for more than something like 3 seconds, it's not supposed to come up on anything but its proper frequency if it comes up at all. And these transmitters were failing, coming up on 145.0 because they hadn't done the proper tests. Some of them, the SWR, the filters, blew the PAs up, and others, they were radiating. All because this certain company, which I won't name, in Hampshire, had done a bloody awful job of testing. But of course, there's a lot of pressure on test houses that if you don't pass our equipment, you don't get any more business. Mind you, that's the same company. You know these little radios that play your Bluetooth through your car radio and operating the FM band? They were saying that they could approve these radios by doing measurements on an open-air test site with the FM broadcast transmitter 10 miles away in line of sight.
I mean, we used to do our testing within house and then take it out to an actual fact in Nuremberg, which was possibly beyond our company, and then they would test it as well. But what about the Chinese and all the stuff that they're jumping out?
I mean, we did a lot of testing in anechoic chambers. We did some at Swansea University and some at Bristol. But of course, by that time, we were down to being able to do tests and self-certify, although we weren't actually manufacturing transmitters at the time, but only the ICs, but we were down to being able to certify. Now, the fact that you can self-certify now is a total disaster. Interestingly, anybody looked at the new Apache Labs AN8000 SDR review in this month's Radcom? Now, according to their website and information, it meets all European standards. Like bloody hell it does. It is out for harmonics on 80, 30 and 6. It doesn't carry a CE mark. So how on earth can it be said to meet the requirements? And this does mean that Lynchy in Nevada, if they do sell it, they're acting very illegally. And they should have picked up on that. So we're currently doing input to the CEPT report. That's being coordinated by Don Beattie, G3BJ, Region 1 Chairman, or G3OZF as I always know him. So we've got that one ongoing. Got Walk 19. Right, what have we got coming up there? 50 to 54 megs, non-GSO satellites, trackside railway communications.
Can you expand on that, please?
That's in the millimetric wave bands, of 24 and 70 gigs. For things, some cab signalling, some train detection.
Is this the new system where they're going to put the actual signalling in the cab of the train?
Well, there's that, but there's also putting in effectively radars at AHB crossings in order to detect if there's some silly bugger in the way. Mind you, when you take all these people who drive round the barriers and get in the way, it can be a bit late. I can't say that I can ever manage any sympathy for them if the train hits them.
Well, since it takes about a mile to stop on HST.
Well, that's right.
Sympathise with the train driver.
Well, yes. 24 to 86 gigs international mobile telecoms. 275 to 450 gigs mobile and fixed. RLAN at 5 gigs. Radio expansion of the radio local area networks at 5 gigs, which we started on RLANs at 5 gigs with the Hyperland program back in 1992 at Etsy. And then, of course, we got the wireless power transfer business. So there's quite a lot of things that can affect amateur radio. Yes, a lot of it's up at microwaves, but we don't want to lose spectrum. And of course, non-GSO satellites could be affecting satellites at 2 meters and 70 sems. So, how can the amateur support this work at IARU? Join the National Society. Be an RSGB member. And remember, who keeps our wavelengths? Where do our wavelengths come from? Without wavelengths, there is no amateur radio. That's why IARU is important. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Reference PLT. Who is or what is the main driver on this? Is it the people who want to use the system to communicate, or what do the electricity companies do, or how do they get their cut?
No, well, PLT in the home is basically pushed by people who want to sell equipment. Mm-hmm. So we were at this WP1A meeting, and a man came along from ITUT to tell us about it. And we made the comment that, of course, he said, we've arranged the standards to notch out all the 6 HF amateur bands. So up goes my card. Mr. Chairman, is the gentleman from ITUT not aware that since 1979 there have been 9 HF amateur bands? And he gets all lost and he says, oh, I should have known that, I've got an amateur licence. He was a Canadian, but he wasn't from Newfoundland. PLT's gone relatively quiet, and now we've got them notching the amateur bands. It helps. A bigger problem is VDSL. It's where I'm very glad that I am far enough from the exchange. I can only get 1.5 megabits per second if I'm lucky, and it's all on underground cables.
But a lot of the VDSL stuff is Chinese, isn't it? It's not actually European equipment.
No, there's not that many European manufacturers now. I mean, if you look at even a lot of the design work, it's done in China. Isn't it, Lynn?
Yeah.
She goes out teaching them how to use the software to design the ICs. So yes, there's an awful lot of this rubbish is just raising the radio noise level. Now, there may be ways round it with very clever signal processing, but it's certainly getting to be a total pain. Any more questions? No?
No, okay, thank you folks. I think the message is clear. There's a lot more to all this amateur radio stuff in the background than most of us are aware. I know I knew about most of those, but that's opened my eyes to some. And the end answer is, John, how much you reach out to us? That's where our input is in to help all this out. Thanks very much for being, as usual, for an entertaining talk and very, very thought-provoking. Thank you very much, Peter.
Well, just remember, it always seems very simple, and it isn't always. It reminds me of the story of the little American town, one-horse town. And one Sunday morning, about 9:30 on the road out of town, there's the Roman Catholic priest in his robes, and there's the Episcopalian priest in his get-up, hammering a stake into the ground with a sign on it saying, "Turn back ere it is too late." And the local wide boy comes tearing up in his car, screeches to a halt, winds the window down and yells, "Why don't you religious nuts leave us alone?" and then tears off again. And the car goes round the bend and there's a squeal of brakes and a splash and silence. And the Episcopalian minister says, "Father, do you think we ought to change the sign to bridge washed out, road closed?"